It was the morning after Easter when the silence in the Vatican became more than absence. It became presence, a silence so deep that it seemed to cradle something divine, like the breath held before a sacred revelation. At exactly 7:35 a.m., the world lost a voice, but heaven gained a soul. Pope Francis had passed away. For many, it was just another date. But for those who understand the language of faith, it was a whisper of eternity. He left the world right after the celebration of Christ's resurrection, as if he had waited, quietly, purposefully, to complete his earthly mission on the heels of a divine promise: life after death. That dawn was unlike any other. In the narrow corridors of the Vatican hospital, something unspoken stirred the air. Doctors, nuns, and staff moved with reverent caution, as though they were not just treating a patient, but accompanying a soul toward the threshold of eternity. The lights in his room were dimmed, casting a golden glow like a candle flickering before it rests. Time itself slowed down. Pope Francis lay still, his breathing slow, his eyes gently closed, but there was a quiet awareness in him, as though he knew, as though he could already feel the veil thinning between the world he was leaving behind and the one waiting for him. He wasn't surrounded by heads of state, cardinals in crimson, or dignitaries in tailored suits. Instead, a single man stood by his side, a nurse named Massimiliano. He wasn't a man of titles, but of service, a quiet presence, a familiar face who had seen the Pope on his weakest days, who knew the rhythm of his breath, the weariness in his bones, and the silent strength in his eyes. And it was to this man, not to the cameras or the crowd, that Pope Francis turned with the last ounce of his strength. No proclamations, no rehearsed speeches, just one final, heartfelt whisper, and the room, the air, the very walls held their breath. There was no grandeur in that moment, only grace. There was no ceremony, only sacredness. Francis, even in the end, was faithful to who he had always been, a shepherd who chose to walk among his sheep, not above them. He had spent his life preaching that the church must leave its palaces and go to the margins, to the sick, to the forgotten. And now, in his final moments, he chose to die not surrounded by symbols of power, but beside someone who had spent his life healing without ever asking for recognition. Outside, the city was still asleep, but inside that quiet room, heaven was touching earth. If you felt the presence of something greater through this story, we invite you to click the like button and comment Amen to receive a special blessing in our next video. Also, tell us from which city you're watching. We'd love to include your home in our prayers and send a word of light just for you. And when the time came, when his breath grew shallow and his voice no longer rose, he simply looked at Massimiliano and gave him a look of peace, of completion. Then he whispered something, a phrase that was not meant for microphones, but for the soul, a phrase that would travel farther than any sermon ever could. At 7:38 a.m., just 3 minutes later, the bells of nearby churches began to toll, not in celebration, in reverence. The world didn't know yet, but heaven did. And within those 3 minutes, a sacred silence had already begun to echo across the stones of the Vatican, carrying with it the weight of a final message that would soon change hearts and lives. Before we continue, if this story has already touched your heart, I invite you to be part of our growing community. Subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. It's through your support that we can continue sharing these stories of faith, light, and hope. And don't forget to comment your name and city. We'd love to greet you in our next video with a blessing sent just for you. The whisper of Pope Francis to Massimiliano was not heard by many, but its echo was destined to reach the hearts of millions. It wasn't a proclamation, it wasn't a doctrine, it was something deeper, a seed planted in silence. The nurse, caught in the intimacy of that moment, leaned in close. His eyes met those of the Pope. eyes no longer filled with the weight of the world, but softened by a quiet, eternal clarity. Then came the words, uttered softly, yet vibrating with spiritual force. "Thank you for bringing me back to the square." At first, Massimiliano didn't understand. The words were too simple, too human. But as they settled in his heart, they began to burn with sacred meaning. The square, Piazza San Pietro, was not just a place. For Pope Francis, it was the heartbeat of the people, the altar of presence, the sacred space where the invisible met the tangible through the touch of the faithful, the cries of the poor, the hands of the sick. It was the place where God walked in the faces of those forgotten by society. Francis had returned there one last time on Easter Sunday, his body weakened, his strength fading, but his smile radiant. Against the advice of some, and with the gentle encouragement of Massimiliano, he stepped once more into the Pope-mobile, waved to the crowd, and allowed his presence, fragile, human, real, to be felt by those gathered. He didn't need speeches. His presence was the message. Now, in that final moment, he was saying thank you, not just to the nurse who had cared for him, but to everyone who had carried him in prayer, who had believed in a church close to the people. He was saying thank you to those who stood in the rain in that square over the years, who whispered Ave Marias with trembling lips, who found hope in his gaze. That final whisper became, for Massimiliano, a sacred burden, not one of sorrow, but of mission. The Pope had not handed him a secret, he had handed him a torch. And though he didn't wear a robe or sit on a throne, in that moment he became a messenger. The news of the Pope's passing was still contained within the hospital walls. Vatican security was instructed to maintain silence. There were no immediate bulletins, no public mourning yet. And yet, something intangible was already stirring. In the chapel inside the hospital, a single candle flickered. Outside, dawn light began to stretch across the rooftops of Rome. A breeze moved through the trees in the Vatican gardens, almost like a breath. The world was about to know, but for now it was heaven's turn to weep in gratitude. Then the ripple began. One nurse whispered to another. A doctor paused in the hallway and closed her eyes. A Monsignor heard and fell to his knees, not because of the death alone, but because of what had been said. Massimiliano, still holding the Pope's hand, repeated the words quietly, "Thank you for bringing me back to the square." And with each repetition, the weight of that message became clearer. It was a final blessing disguised as gratitude, a homily spoken with breath instead of voice. A last act of love from a man who had spent his life pouring himself out for others. The message began to move through the corridors, not through press releases or headlines, but from heart to heart. The few who heard it understood. This wasn't just a goodbye, it was a confirmation. The church would continue. The people were the square, and the Pope had made peace. And yet, even as the Vatican prepared for the inevitable announcement, there was a sense that this would not be an ordinary mourning. Something about the way he departed, gentle, intimate, surrounded not by spectacle but by sincerity, had elevated the moment. It became sacred. As the sun fully rose over the dome of St. Peter's, the world still didn't know. But something was about to be revealed, something that would not only stir the heart of the Church, but reignite the flame of compassion across nations. If this story has brought you closer to the light of faith, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Together we are building a loving community that honors stories of spirit and truth. We'd also love to hear where you're from. Drop your name and city in the comments, and we'll be sure to bless your home in our next video with a message from the heart. The phrase kept echoing, "Thank you for bringing me back to the square." Simple, unadorned, and yet pregnant with meaning. For Massimiliano, it wasn't just a sentence, it was a key that unlocked the full depth of everything Pope Francis had stood for. In the hours that followed, that phrase would transcend the walls of the hospital, not through official Vatican declarations or solemn broadcasts, but like a sacred whisper passed from soul to soul. Those who heard it couldn't explain why they were moved. It wasn't just what was said, but how it had been said and to whom. That Easter Sunday visit to St. Peter's Square had seemed brief. Many noticed how pale the Pope looked, how slow his movements had become. But what the crowd couldn't see was the divine effort behind every smile, every wave, every look of love. Francis had known it was his final public appearance, and still, he went, not for obligation, but for the people. It was Massimiliano who had encouraged him days earlier when the Pope had hesitated. "You don't need to speak," the nurse had said gently. "Just be seen. Let them know you're still with them." It wasn't a clinical suggestion. It was a moment of intuition, perhaps even inspiration. And the Pope, despite the pain, had nodded. That moment, seemingly small, had become eternal. Because when Francis looked out onto the square, he saw more than a crowd. He saw the faces of those who had prayed for him, the countless poor and forgotten he had embraced, the little ones he had blessed in wheelchairs, the broken who found healing in his gaze. Returning to the square was his final pastoral act, not with a homily, not with decrees, but with presence. And that presence was love in its purest form. Now, with the world still unaware of his passing, the few who were present began to understand the power of that return. Massimiliano in particular carried a quiet awe. He had been part of something far beyond his role as a nurse. He had become a witness to a prophetic fulfillment. The Pope had not only come full circle in his mission, he had sealed it with humility. In the corridors of the Vatican, word began to spread. "He said it was the square," someone whispered. He was grateful for that moment. A guard, eyes moist, simply nodded. No need for full explanations. Those who served closely understood that for Pope Francis, gestures always spoke louder than decrees. That final thank you was not simply a message to one man. It was a message to the world. Return to the square. Return to the heart. Return to the people. Because that is where the Church lives, not in marble halls or golden altars, but in human connection, in love without condition, in presence that heals. As the Vatican prepared for the official announcement, a sense of sacred anticipation filled the air. What would be said to the public? How would the world receive the news? What would be remembered? But for those in that small hospital room, the story was already complete. The Pope had left no formal proclamation, but his life had been his message. And his last words, those 7 quiet syllables, were enough to light a fire in every soul who truly listened. The square would not be empty. His spirit would remain in every embrace, every act of mercy, every smile shared with the forgotten. And the world, still unaware of the full meaning of that Easter morning, was about to discover the echo of eternity left behind by one final gesture. If this message has touched you, we invite you to be part of our loving and growing community. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It's a simple gesture, but it helps us continue spreading messages that illuminate the heart. And don't forget to share your name and city in the comments. We'd be honored to pray for you and mention your name with love in our next video. In the quiet after his passing, something began to take root in the hearts of those who had stood near him in his final days, an understanding that weakness was not a defeat, it was sacred ground. Pope Francis had always preached that the Church must not fear its own wounds, for it is through the wounds that grace flows. Now, through his own declining body, he had shown them what that really meant. Massimiliano, still stunned by the weight of that final thank you, stayed near. He didn't speak much, and no one expected him to. In his eyes was a reverence few could understand. He had watched the Pope's strength dwindle over days, watched the pain creep into his limbs and settle into his breath, and yet he had also seen the Pope's peace deepen. As his physical strength diminished, his spiritual presence grew more radiant. Every small moment became a sacrament, a cup of water, a prayer whispered under breath, a blanket drawn gently to his shoulders. None of it dramatic, all of it sacred. During the 38 days of hospitalization that preceded his passing, Francis had refused to hide. He allowed himself to be seen, not just as the vicar of Christ, but as a man who struggled with weakness, with limitation, and with the deep ache of approaching death. And in doing so, he became even more of a shepherd. He showed the world that holiness is not perfection, it is love made visible in brokenness. To the nurses, to the staff, to the guards who saw him each day, the transformation was quiet but undeniable. He didn't preach about the dignity of the sick. He became the message. Even when he no longer had the strength to lift his arms in blessing, the soft smile on his lips was enough to heal. Even when words escaped him, the warmth in his eyes spoke volumes. And to Massimiliano, these were not just the last days of a pontificate. They were a daily revelation. He watched the Pope surrender to the hands of others, not out of resignation, but out of trust. He allowed himself to be carried, clothed, turned, and comforted. The humility in that surrender was its own kind of homily. Francis had often said, the Church must be a field hospital after battle. But now he was showing that sometimes the Church is the wounded soldier, in need of gentle hands. Sometimes even the Pope must be carried. It was during one of those long nights that Massimiliano realized something that would stay with him forever. As he sat beside the Pope, offering only silence, Francis reached out and rested a frail hand on his. No words, just presence, just connection. It was then that Massimiliano understood. This was the true spiritual power of the Church. Not dominance, not authority, but tenderness. Those final days became for everyone around him a spiritual retreat. The Vatican corridors were quieter, the hospital chapel more crowded, the mood not somber but contemplative. Something holy was unfolding, and even those who didn't believe could feel it. And then came that Easter Sunday, the final return to the square. No one could have guessed it would be his last appearance. But now, in the light of his whispered gratitude, it was clear. That moment was not weakness defied, but mission fulfilled. He had returned, not to be seen, but to offer himself one last time. To walk in the square meant he was still among the people, still loving them, even as death drew close. And when he returned to the hospital that afternoon, his face bore not exhaustion, but serenity. He had done what he came to do. He had loved until the end. If you felt the presence of something greater through this story, we invite you to click the like button and comment Amen to receive a special blessing in our next video. Also, tell us from which city you're watching. We'd love to include your home in our prayers and send a word of light just for you. The Vatican bells had long ceased ringing. The world now knew of the Pope's passing, and yet, for those who had truly seen him, who had stood beside him in the twilight of his life, the sound that lingered was not sorrow. It was gratitude. Francis had gone, but he had not left them empty. His final words, so simple yet eternal, had lit a flame in the hearts of those who heard them. Thank you for bringing me back to the square. These were not just words of thanks. They were the seal of a life lived with purpose, humility, and divine conviction. The square was no longer just cobblestone and columns. It had become a symbol of every act of love, every gesture of service, every tear wiped and hand held. It was the Church, not as an institution, but as a living body, as a communion of souls. Massimiliano returned there in the days that followed, not as a mourner, but as a witness. He stood quietly in the same place where Francis had smiled that final Sunday. He looked around, not for statues or cameras, but for people. The ones Francis had loved so deeply, the ones he had served with every breath. And they were there. Old women lighting candles, children chasing pigeons, young men kneeling in silence, pilgrims praying under the shadow of St. Peter's dome, and in every face a reflection of the Pope's legacy. Francis had not built monuments, he had not carved his name into marble, but he had left something far more enduring: compassion in the hearts of strangers. Faith rekindled in weary souls, mercy that moved through the crowd like a river, and that, Massimiliano realized, was the true miracle. In the chapel that night, he lit a candle, not to mourn, but to say thank you, for the privilege of witnessing love in its purest form, for the sacred silence that had become a message, for the chance to carry forward the light. Francis's story didn't end with his final breath. It continued, in every hand reaching out to another, in every word of forgiveness whispered in pain, in every corner of the world where love dared to shine in the dark. His mission was complete, but his legacy had just begun. And so, to you who are listening now, this is not the end, it is your invitation to be light, to love deeper, to serve without needing to be seen, and to walk always toward the square, toward the heart of others. If this message touched your soul, we warmly invite you to like this video and comment Amen to be part of this spiritual wave of blessings. Let us know which city you're watching from so we can send even more light and prayer your way in the next video. And don't stop here. A revelatory and glorious message awaits you. Just click the next video that's appearing on your screen right now. It might change your life forever. Thank you for walking this path with us. Amen.